started. Good morning, everyone. I think it's still good morning for the East Coast people as well. So we're good to say good morning. If everyone's having a good morning so far, and I certainly appreciate you being here this morning. Before we get started, I just want to put a plug in for the Utah Postdoctoral Association. We are just a group of volunteers, group of volunteer postdocs that put together professional development, network, and social opportunities for postdocs, and as well as advocates on our behalf. Anyone at University of Utah are automatically members, and we do encourage you, if you're at University of Utah, to be involved. So you can visit our website at upda.utah.edu to learn more, or reach out to me afterwards, and I can obviously connect you with more information as well. And just to let you know, this meeting is being recorded and will be shared afterwards for people who could not attend today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to start out with just a little brief introduction of our panel today. So the purpose of this panel is to have a conversation on the pitfalls and limitations of including race and/or ethnicity in research studies, as well as recommendations for improving how race and ethnicity are included in our research. Race and ethnicity are very often included in research studies in some form, either as a direct focus of racial or ethnic disparities in health outcomes and achievement, or indirectly as a covariate. Despite having good intentions by including race and ethnicity in research, there can be unintended consequences that may misrepresent the reason for including race and ethnicity. For example, when it perpetuates inaccurate essentialist perspectives of biological differences. One key driver to racial and ethnic disparities is racism. Hashtag racism, not race. In this panel, the contribution of racism to disparities is not in question. As postdocs transitioning to become principal investigators and leaders in our respective fields, it is critical, if not one of our chief responsibilities, to understand why and how we include race and ethnicity in our research studies so that we can respectively represent the humans that have contributed to our data. Before we begin, I just have some ground rules I would like to set. First, please save questions till the Q&A session, which would be like approximately the last 15 minutes of our time. I said at that time, you include your questions in the chat, although we don't have too many people. So if you want to use the raise your hand feature, you can also ask your question vocally as well. Please be respectful and courteous of our panel members and fellow attendees when asking questions. As moderator, I have the right to refuse a question or mute or remove attendees if needed. Our panel members also have the right not to address questions that are not deemed respectful. Now, I would like to introduce, and it's my honor to introduce our two panel members for today, Dr. Michael Udell and Dr. Adolfo Cuevas. Dr. Udell is a Vice Dean and Professor in the College of Health Solutions at Arizona State University. Dr. Udell's research centers on public health ethics with a focus on the history and ethics of genomics and the history of the concept of race. Among his scholarly publications, he has authored work on race in research, including, but not limited to, a letter to the NIH to encourage them to do better, and a book entitled Race Unmasked, Biology and Race in the 20th Century. Dr. Udell, is there anything you would like to add? Nope, cool. And for our second panelist is Dr. Cuevas. Dr. Cuevas is an assistant professor of race, culture, and society and community health at Tufts University School of Arts and Sciences, and the director of the Psychosocial Determinants of Health group at Tufts University. Dr. Cuevas' research centers on the intersection of race, ethnicity, psychosocial stress, and aging-related diseases. Among his scholarly publications, he has authored work on race and ethnicity in research, including a comprehensive review of race and skin color and Latino health, and a recent commentary, which I encourage you to read after this, on the scientific contributions of understanding racial diversity among Afro-Latino communities. Dr. Cuevas, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, that was great. I'll pay you later.
Okay. This was your opportunity to plug in all's work, so, but we'll continue on here. Well, Dr. Udell and Dr. Cuevas, I would like to personally thank you both for taking time out of your busy days to share your knowledge and recommendations. We're very grateful to have you here, and it is an honor to get your perspective. So thank you very much. I have 3 general questions that we'll work through, and then afterwards we can open it up from questions from the audience. I think we got everyone introduced here. So I'll pose the first question, and I'll pose it to you initially, Dr. Udell, and then we'll have Dr. Cuevas jump in, and obviously you can go back and forth if you want. For the first question, what are some potential pitfalls, or as I said in the intro, unintended consequences that can occur when race and or ethnicity is included in research studies?
Wow. Well, thanks again for inviting me to this panel. And I learned when I looked at the, I knew Adolfo and I were both on this panel together, but what I didn't know was that he was the Gerald Gill professor at Tufts. And I emailed him yesterday that Jerry Gill was my advisor at Tufts and a good friend who passed away unexpectedly about 15 years ago. So it's really an honor to see you in that role, Adolfo, and to be here with you today and to be with all of you. So pitfalls. Just sort of, I'll take a minute to sort of provide a bigger perspective to my thinking on this and dive into some of the pitfalls. So I wrote a book 8 years ago now called Race Unmasked, and it's a history of the use and misuse of the race concept from eugenics to the Genome Project. Oh my God, now they're drilling in my ceiling. I don't know if you guys can hear that. Somebody doesn't want us talking about this topic today, apparently. Wow, that is a crazy noise. Anyway, I wrote this book, and you know, after the book came out, it was reviewed widely and nicely, except for one review in the journal Nature that I thought was really not fair. It was by a historian colleague that I know well and have a lot of respect for, but he compared my book to a book called Troublesome Inheritance by Nicholas Wade, who was a science writer for the New York Times for years, and frankly, a racist. And Wade made all these crazy claims in the book that, you know, there is race, and that, you know, he pointed to Africa as an example of the relationship between genetics and race, because his claim was that the challenges that are ongoing in Africa couldn't be due to colonization, they had to be due to genetics. He then made claims about my people, Jewish people, being good with money and therefore having a gene for banking. Of course, that's terribly anti-Semitic and ridiculous. Anyway, my book, which claimed that, made arguments tracing the history of race, and at the end spoke about why race was so problematic, was equally as wrong as this terribly racist book. And frankly, it infuriated me. And I made the decision to make a bigger policy argument about the misuse of race, which we did first in the journal Science in 2016 with a follow-up article in 2020. And the argument was essentially that race is a few things. One, race is not a particularly good phylogenetic or population genetic proxy for classifying humans into groups. That is because humans have been sharing genetic material between populations on continents for millennia, and we are therefore a genetically heterogeneous species. It doesn't mean that there aren't certain gene frequencies that are higher and lower in certain areas, but that race as a proxy for health and other traits is actually much more complicated than thinking about it singularly, continentally, or even, you know, more granular racial groups. You know, that's the first problem. The second is, okay, so race is a proxy. We know it's a social construction, but it's the best proxy we have to understand the relationship between our genes, our environment, our culture, and our health. So we're going to use it anyway. Problem with that, of course, is that those determinations are probabilities. So let's say you have a gene that is in a high frequency in a white population, or in a subpopulation somewhere on the African or Asian continent, as examples. But the gene is only 80% present. A particular variant is only 80% present, let's say, for a metabolizing, a drug metabolizing gene. So that's great. So 80% sounds really high. What about the other 20%? At the population level, that's a really big number. That means, 20% of people could potentially have a bad reaction to a drug if that determination is made based on a racial best guess. And then finally, what we argued is that, race is a historical idea mired in contemporary controversy, and that it has no place in modern genetic practice. Race has both scientific and social meanings that are impossible to tease apart. And we worried that using such a concept in modern genetics did not serve the field well. So poor proxy, misleading proxy, and can't tease the historical, contemporary, and let's say methodological rationale for using race apart. So those would be my three reasons. I'll stop there.
So that's, I guess, a wonderful segue into some of the major points I want to raise in terms of some of the pitfalls and limitations in when including race, ethnicity in health research. And by the way, it's indeed an honor to be in this panel with Dr. Udell. It's one of my I've enjoyed reading some of your work along the way, especially starting back in CBAS. I think it was like 2018. So indeed a pleasure. So I would begin by kind of highlighting why I've begun to get interested in this, the idea of how to develop better constructs of race ethnicity. And just very briefly, it began in 2016 specifically, that year, because I wanted to highlight racial disparities within the Hispanic Latino population. This is one of the most overlooked areas in Latino health discourse, whereby Black Latinos, Afro-Latinos typically have poor health compared to their white counterparts. And why is that? And why do we begin to overlook this very sizable population in the United States? It's about 25% of Latinos identify as Afro-Latino, yet they're basically overlooked in this discourse. The interesting part of this is when you ask an Afro-Latino, do you identify as Black? Only 2% of them would actually say yes, they identify as Black. And so what are we really capturing when we're talking about race and ethnicity, and especially from the perspective of participants? And this is where I feel like there's an interesting conversation to be had about what are different ways we could begin capturing true lived experiences that helps shape people's life trajectory over time. So that's basically is the foundation for the kind of work that I'm doing, and I think this kind of leads into the typical pitfalls that researchers typically engage in. And I would say first is that race is poorly measured. Existing race ethnicity categories are restrictive. They do not fully capture or embrace the wide range of social identities within racial categories. And ignoring this particular dynamic oftentimes leads to a poor understanding of lived experiences, particularly among subgroups within a particular racial and ethnic category. The second is that while researchers recognize or beginning to recognize that race and ethnicity has no biological meaning, it still has very, very important social meanings. And over the years, if you go back into the 1960s, 1970s, you begin to see health researchers recommending the removal of race in surveys, and I feel, and this is actually becoming coming out again by, or being recommended by researchers again, basically removing race, and given that they feel that this will actually lead to an interpretation that everything is, race is connected with biology. And I think this particular recommendation is quite dangerous, given that neglecting race ignores the reality of social stratification and structural racism, and therefore begins to conceal existing racial disparities. Then the last one I would say is that race and ethnicity, one of the common pitfalls, is oftentimes is used as a proxy for culture, socioeconomic status. And this as well is very dangerous and an ill-advised approach, given that oftentimes there are race and ethnicities intertwined with culture, socioeconomic status, geographic and socio-political forces, and there's great heterogeneity within racial and ethnic groups. And by using that as a proxy, you begin to actually create new forms of stereotypes pertaining to particular groups. Actually, and I lied, there's one more that I should mention here, and this is in studies where we compare racial and ethnic groups. This is a very common approach to health research, basically looking at whether there's racial ethnic disparities. And while this indeed allows us to better understand health inequities and health inequalities, the problem here is that oftentimes white participants are used as a reference group, and anything that deviates from that particular group is considered to be abnormal, and this is extremely dangerous. Then the last one is that, and this is the where I feel like there's a really interesting conversation, is if you don't see racial ethnic disparities, oftentimes people move on to the next issue. And this is extremely dangerous, given that even though you may not see a black-white disparity, say for example in liver cancer incidence, it doesn't necessarily mean that liver cancer incidence is not still a public health problem for a particular group. And by basically saying, well, no racial disparities here, this is not a problem, let's move on to the next thing, it further exacerbates existing racial health inequities. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you both. I think those are really good pitfalls that you brought up. And this sort of second question is, I mean, you both touched on it just a little bit anyways with the pitfalls, because they're highly connected. What are some limitations or barriers that postdoctoral researchers may encounter when including race or ethnicities in their research study, either collecting new data, or often, as postdocs have to do, is work with existing data sets, such as national data sets or registries?
Yeah, so I would say here, oftentimes, and there's a recognition that, especially for postdocs, oftentimes we rely on surveys, secondary data sets. And so there's that acknowledgement here that this is an issue. And so I would say there's, at least moving forward, the best approach is at least to recognize the limitations in how previous researchers have collected data. And so the first one I would say is that racial identification, oftentimes, and this is something that is not necessarily discussed much in health research, is that racial identification sometimes could fluctuate within individuals, especially for people who are of mixed race. They may identify as one particular group based on their social network, their social identification, and that may shift over time. And oftentimes in secondary data, they only collect, especially in these longitudinal studies, they oftentimes only collect race data at baseline and never again. And I think this really tends to kind of ignore people's real lived experience across the life course. I also think that another limitation, and maybe this is for folks who are collecting data, is to begin to think about the participants that they're actually working with, and really begin to develop tailored racial categories that is much closely connected to the community that they're in. Because oftentimes the existing, if you, for example, use the census race category, this is quite restrictive in terms of the options that people could actually choose. And that's in many ways could work in some cases, but may not necessarily work for the participants that you're in, that may actually have extreme heterogeneity. So if you're working, for example, with specifically with the Black community, you may want to take advantage and ask them about ethnic identification pertaining to subcategories within the Black/African American group to better enrich your health research moving forward.
Yeah, I think those are great points, Adolfo. I would build on your point to say that there are real structural barriers for researchers, postdocs and otherwise, to be more creative in how we utilize and analyze data. And I would point to the inclusion enrollment form that is ubiquitous in federally funded research, which collects only race and ethnicity data. And there are real challenges that are both political in nature and scientific in nature. The political challenges are that Office of Management and Budget form, the inclusion enrollment form, was meant to create more inclusive research. It was meant to bring populations who were underrepresented in research into research and to push researchers to recruit more diverse samples, which is fantastic. The problem is that if you're on the biological sciences side of things, and those are the variables that you are essentially told to collect, and your sophistication with, let's say, social and behavioral science research or any type of sociological research is limited, you're going to rely on that data, and it's reinforced a system where racial data, particularly in genetic disparities research, is prioritized. It's not saying that there aren't geneticists who do more sophisticated research, but frankly, there aren't a whole lot. And I don't want to blame geneticists for that. It's really not their fault. It's that they're not trained in social science methods to, be able to do the type of sophisticated, social determinant, biological determinant, and environmental determinant research that will give us a much richer understanding of health disparities. And look, Adolfo's heard me made this point before. W.E.B. Du Bois told us the nature of health disparities in 1896 after spending 3 months walking around Philadelphia and collecting data on about 9,000 individuals. And he was able to identify that there were what he called organic causes for health disparities that were biological, they were cultural, they were educational, and we're still doing that. We're still collecting that data, and we're still looking at disparities through that lens, which is really unfortunate. It's one of the reasons why myself and my co-authors on the 2 science pieces I mentioned earlier have been calling for the NIH to change essentially how it does business. And in fact, back in February, a committee was formed at the National Academies to start the process of investigating best practices for the use of race in genetics research. Frankly, it's not enough, because this isn't just about genetics. This is about how we do research, across academia, in public health, in sociology, and in genetics and anthropology. So, I think that there may be some cracks in the edifice. I'm not holding my breath. Yesterday was the first public meeting for that group. And it was great to watch geneticists and social scientists sort of tussle over how to move forward. But I still worry that we're going to end up in a pretty similar place when this is all done.
can I also mention that during the CBAS workshop that occurred, I believe this was again like 2018. Something that Dr. Udell mentioned that stuck with me was that that very same study of W.B. Du Bois of finding racial differences in health and health outcomes so early on, and we're still doing this kind of research of just basically highlighting racial differences. What are we really adding to the literature, and how are we moving beyond this to better understand what are some of the social constructs that actually help explain these health inequities, and this is something that stuck with me because we indeed have to move beyond looking at racial differences and begin to kind of look at these potential mediators that help explain existing health inequities moving forward. So,
I will be back there this summer again, pleading with young social scientists and biological scientists to heed that call. So I'm glad it left an impression.
Hopefully you're leaving an impression on everyone here today as well, and those who watch this afterwards. So thank you both for contributing to that. For the final question, given these pitfalls and limitations, and the sort of persistence of including race and ethnicity in research studies, given it's a common practice, even though we should think about other ways, what can you recommend to postdoctoral researchers for improving the way they include race or ethnicity in their future research, or even as reviewers of research studies? I'll pose that to you first, and Dr. Udell, if you want to take it.
Sure. I would make 2 points. First is, when I talk about removing race from, the biological sciences, it doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge the reality of racism and that race is an important cultural identifier for people. The challenge, of course, is how to use that terminology in research so that you don't replicate biological notions of difference, and that you are actually, looking more granularly at what is causing and underlying health disparities. So I would suggest 2 things. One, when you do use racial terminology in research, define it. Make it abundantly clear why you are using that terminology, the role it plays in your methodology and in your data collection, and its limitations, which, the most you see generally, particularly in the natural science literature, is we acknowledge that race is a social construction, however, and then it's used as a biological construction. So just, define it and be careful in making sure that you're really justifying how and why you're using it. The second, if you're on the natural sciences side of the house, find a social science friend, work with them, partner, think about how, if you're a postdoc and starting to apply for grants, how, what a social science lens will bring to your thoughts on understanding health disparities or analyzing, gene frequencies and variants, within and between populations. I think that fix alone, if NIH would fund, just to provide guidance to researchers to partner and do more interdisciplinary research, I think that could solve a lot of the challenges we're facing now.
just to build on that was great. I think as researchers, we should not assume that our readers would know, especially if we're doing racial disparities research. Do not assume that the readers actually know what explains racial differences in health outcomes. And here, I think it's our responsibility to move beyond just reporting the statistical significance in terms when comparing two racial groups or more than that, and begin to kind of explain what helps explain these racial differences. Oftentimes, as Kamara Jones, racial differences are intertwined with systemic racism, interpersonal racism, and even internalized racism. And I think this needs a fair amount of explanation in one's research to help illuminate and really color the findings in many ways. I would also say that maybe re-emphasize something that Dr. Udell mentioned, and it's about knowing your participants, and this takes a level of a priori understanding of your group, and to develop something, especially for those who are collecting data, really help it helps the reader and yourself to better understand the group that you're working with. And this actually, I would say, starts off with building a relationship with your community, and not doing some drive-by research, but really immersing yourself in the community, understanding the racial dynamics within it, understanding potential heterogeneity. And then that helps, in the end, your interpretation of results pertaining to perhaps racial differences, in this case, of health outcomes.
I think those are great recommendations, and I just want to reiterate them for people to think about as they continue doing research and reviewing. One, define and justify including race or ethnicity in your research. Collaborate with social scientists, especially if you're within a more health-oriented field, to get a better understanding of the construct of race. Explain what differences mean, especially when we're doing disparities research, and not just assume the readers know. And then have a priori understanding of the population or group that you're working with, which I think emphasizes community engaged research, as Dr. Cuevas was saying. I do want to, we got about 5 minutes, and we have, the ears and expertise of two renowned scholars here on this topic. So I want to give everyone the opportunity to ask a question within this little bit of time left. Feel free to jump in.
I'm going to jump in. As I mentioned in the chat, I work in human genomics, and sort of a problem that you've described already is the use of white control groups, right? So often in genetics, we'll say, okay, well, here's our control population, and then we compare an individual to that population. So going forward, there's been some efforts to try and recruit more diverse populations in order to build better controls. And I guess my question is, so the way that I'm sort of thinking about going about this is to build a diverse cohort and then let that be your cohort and move on. Is that sort of a sensible way of going about things? And the alternative approach would be to try and divide up your controls based on some measure of ancestry, race, ethnicity, something like that. That's the alternative that I've seen proposed.
Adolfo, you want to jump in because that was your point?
Yeah, I would say that if you're talking about potential comparison groups, I think there is an acknowledgement in terms of who is your control group, and I think there needs to be a level of justification there, and this is especially when we're talking about what type of potential privilege that control group may actually have, that may be playing a huge role in any potential deviation, statistically deviation that is significant. And I would say that my recommendation here, or at least my idea about control groups, is not necessarily to just completely absolve that particular approach. I think there's important things that could actually manifest from doing some type of comparative analysis. It's just, what are we actually then saying if we do see differences between groups? And there, I think there needs to be in papers an acknowledgement that it's not necessarily anything pertaining to genetics or biological reasons, but there are some social forces that perhaps wasn't measured in the study that actually begins to help explain some of these group differences.
I'd like to jump in. You talked a little bit about these social forces. If we have the opportunity to do some primary data collection, do you have any recommendations for what we can capture in those surveys or in the qualitative interviews, for example, around that?
Yes, I do. I think like one of the big ones that's oftentimes used, because race oftentimes is used as a proxy for socioeconomic status, and oftentimes whenever I read papers that doesn't use race as a proxy for that particular construct, I'm like, why didn't they just collect socioeconomic status and put that in the model in some ways? And I think that's the first more obvious one. But I also think if people have the opportunity to develop a survey to begin to include race-related constructs like everyday discrimination scale, that really does play a huge role above and beyond socioeconomic status to explain differences in health outcomes. I also, one thing, at least if you're working with the Hispanic Latino population, one area that I'm recommending is socially assigned race, because Hispanic Latinos oftentimes reject the black-white dichotomy that exists in the United States. And even those who may be perceived as Black in the United States oftentimes do not identify as Black. And one way to kind of get around that issue is by asking, Kamara Jones came up with this really amazing measure called socially ascribed race, which is basically ask participants, how do other people within the community or in your society view you racially? And interestingly, socially assigned race is a stronger predictor of health, more so than one's own racial identification. And this will actually get into this understanding of how structural racism really operates to affect ethnic groups like Asian Americans, Latino, Hispanic populations, how structural racism operates within those particular groups.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, just to build on Adolfo's point, I think those are great points. And there's this sort of rumbling in the genetics world about blowing up the boxes, so that instead of folks, and essentially following Kamara Jones, instead of folks like having to choose from 5, 7, 10 racial groups, leave it blank and let people put how they identify themselves in that box, and then analyze the data based on that. The other issue, going back to the structural challenges, is in I think a meeting at the National Academies in 2018 or 19, we learned that the NIH has in fact been working on a document that would be supplemental to the inclusion enrollment form that collects determinants data, but that it's been sitting on a shelf for years collecting dust because they think that it's a burden on researchers, or they can't agree on which determinants data to include in a final version. So, I feel like we are always sitting on, we've been sitting on the edge of being able to improve the science and improve the public's health in this context, but a lot of resistance, a lot of continued resistance to this.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Udall and Dr. Cuevas, for the input on those questions. I do respect everyone's time, so I'm going to cut off questions right now, but I'm sure if you have questions for a specific one of these panelists, I'm sure they'd be happy to connect with you via email. The Utah Postdoctoral Association is also good to host a space to further talk about this in the future. Please feel free to connect with our association. And again, I just want to give another special thank you to Dr. Udell and Dr. Cuevas for taking time today, this morning, to provide us your expertise on this topic and to help us be better researchers going forward.